In 1800, Thomas Jefferson took control of a young and fragile republic. His mission was clear: to pull the United States back toward liberty, restraint, and self-government. Under the previous Federalist government, the country had begun to resemble the very systems it had fought to escape: centralized finance, consolidated authority, and institutions that echoed British power. But opposing power is very different from holding it. With Jefferson at the helm, responsibility for governing a rapidly growing nation shifted to the Democratic Republicans. Ideas that once lived in pamphlets and debates now had to function in the real world, and the same pressures that had confronted Hamilton, Washington, and Adams now confronted their fiercest critics. As Jefferson and his successors attempted to steer the nation toward a freer future, an uncomfortable question emerged, one that would define the next generation of American politics. Did the Federalists betray the country, or were they constrained by forces more powerful than ideology itself? To answer that question honestly, we must first understand the world they were operating in, and the forces shaping their decisions. After the Revolutionary War, the United States remained under intense pressure from Britain. Although the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war in 1783, it did not produce a stable peace. Britain retained control of key frontier forts, supported Native American resistance, restricted American trade, and routinely impressed American sailors into the Royal Navy. Economically, militarily, and diplomatically, the young republic was vulnerable. It was in this environment that Alexander Hamilton, under the Federalist government, pushed for the creation of the Bank of the United States in 1791. What the bank did went far beyond domestic finance. It stabilized government credit, created a reliable fiscal partner for the Treasury, and signaled to European capital markets that the United States was becoming a coherent, investable state. Foreign investors were allowed to purchase shares in the bank, tying European financial interests, including British elites, to the success of the American economy. To Jefferson and his allies, this was betrayal. To the Federalists, it was leverage. By binding British financial interests to American stability, Hamilton altered Britain's incentives. Hostility became costly. Cooperation became profitable. Soon after, the Jay Treaty reduced immediate tensions. British forces withdrew from frontier forts. Trade partially reopened. The risk of renewed war declined. With stability restored, commerce expanded, credit flowed more freely, and the American economy began to grow. From this perspective, Hamilton's strategy was not submission, but containment. The new republic held its territory in exchange for economic stability. This approach stabilized the nation, but it carried a heavy political cost. Centralized finance and foreign capital clashed directly with the revolutionary vision many Americans held dear. Suspicion grew, rumors circulated, and Hamilton became a symbol of everything people feared the republic was becoming. Whether those fears were justified mattered less than the fact that they resonated. The Federalists were economically effective, but politically untrustworthy. Jefferson, Madison, and their allies framed the issue as one of principle: liberty versus consolidation, self-government versus financial entanglement. And in 1800, that argument won. It was now their turn. Once in power, the Democratic Republicans attempted to unwind the Federalist system. Jefferson reduced the national debt significantly. Federal spending was restrained. Central authority was rolled back wherever possible. The goal was to loosen the bond between government, finance, and foreign capital. But global events soon intervened. As Europe descended into the Napoleonic Wars, Britain and France both sought to control global trade. American neutrality, once tolerated, became a problem. Britain, deeply suspicious of the Democratic Republican government's sympathy for France, restricted U.S. commerce, seized American ships, and intensified the impressment of American sailors. Jefferson responded with embargoes, hoping economic restraint would preserve peace. Then, in 1811, the trade war between the United States and Britain at its height, the country made a pivotal move. Under President James Madison, Congress allowed the charter of the First Bank of the United States to expire. Centralized finance was dismantled. Currency control returned to state banks. Supporters saw this as fulfillment of revolutionary principle. To critics, it was reckless. The decision shocked financial circles on both sides of the Atlantic. European banking interests, furious at losing their stake in American finance, reportedly warned that the United States would face severe consequences, including a disastrous war, if the bank were not renewed. 1 year later, the conflict turned violent. The United States was at war. Congress declared war on Britain, citing impressment, trade violations, and failed diplomacy. But beneath the public justifications lay a deeper problem. The nation lacked the financial machinery to fight. Without a national bank, the government depended on state banks and private lenders to finance the war. Credit was fragmented, with varying terms, rates, and risks across states. With no central institution to guarantee repayment, confidence was low and borrowing was expensive. At the same time, trade disruptions slashed customs revenue, the government's main source of income. To cover deficits, treasury notes were issued and direct taxes imposed. State banks issued currency backed by war bonds whose value depended on an uncertain outcome. Paper money multiplied, prices rose, specie dwindled, and bank runs spread. The system began to unravel. In 1814, British forces burned Washington. The attack was brief, but the effect was profound. It was not designed to conquer territory, but to strike confidence. The Capitol and the Treasury were put to the torch, visible proof that the federal government could not protect its own center of power. As word spread, depositors rushed to banks, credit tightened further, and panic accelerated. The war ended not because the United States had prevailed, but because Britain could no longer afford to continue. Years of conflict, trade disruption, domestic unrest, and political instability, including the assassination of Britain's Prime Minister, made prolonged war unattractive. Both sides were exhausted. The Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war borders. Nothing was gained, but something had been learned. The war revealed the truth that ideology could no longer obscure. Liberty without coordination was fragile, and decentralization without systems was dangerous. Ideals, however noble, could not defend a nation by themselves. The Democratic Republicans had dismantled the Federalist machinery, only to discover why it had existed. Early in the War of 1812, the Federalists raised objections at the Hartford Convention. Their arguments were economically rational but politically fatal. By opposing the war and even hinting at secession, they were branded traitors. The party collapsed, but its ambitious figures did not disappear. They simply relocated. Out of the chaos emerged a new political class. They spoke Jeffersonian Republican language, but operated through Hamiltonian Federalist mechanisms. Populist in tone, practical in function. When Federalist banks refused to lend, America's first monopolist, John Jacob Astor, stepped in to finance the state. His capital strengthened Republicans like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, helping them overcome Jeffersonian resistance and restore the National Bank in 1816. Astor's ownership stake revealed the ease with which economic power could bend democratic control. President James Madison resisted at first, but power had shifted. Jeffersonian ideals no longer aligned with power and were no longer politically survivable. The second bank quickly reflected global realities. Ownership was largely private and heavily foreign. European investors once again held significant stakes in the financial core of the United States. The outcome fulfilled the very fears Jefferson had warned against. Not because Jefferson's successors desired it, but because circumstances left them no alternative. They dismantled Federalist power out of principle, only to rebuild it out of necessity. Resistance was impractical. The party's mood had shifted, and no alternative existed. What came next exposes a vital lesson of history. When power moves, political ideology follows. The second bank was built differently. It was designed to impose discipline on a decentralized system of state banks that had collapsed under the strain of the War of 1812. Through land sales, taxes, and trade, the bank accumulated large volumes of state bills. Then, using its federally backed authority, it demanded that state banks redeem those notes in gold and silver. The effect was immediate. State banks could no longer issue freely. Knowing the national bank would routinely call for specie, they were forced to restrain credit and hold adequate reserves. Centralized power returned, but it now flowed from a different center, and the old power holders did not welcome it. Resistance followed. Former Federalist strongholds, once fierce advocates of federal supremacy, now fought bitterly against the bank and invoked states' rights arguments. Having lost their advantage, they adopted Jeffersonian language. The conflict culminated in McCulloch v. Maryland, where the Supreme Court upheld federal supremacy over the states. The ruling confirmed what events had already made clear. Political ideology shifts when incentives change. The dying Federalists now spoke like Jeffersonians. The ruling Republicans now governed like Federalists. Their roles were fully reversed. This era teaches a difficult lesson. When we are in times of crisis, it is the political debate, ideological battles, and moral posturing that dominates the headlines. Yet when we pull back the curtain and look beyond the surface, a more uncomfortable picture emerges. Political conflict is not the engine of change. It is the theater built around it. Beneath elections and ideology lie deeper forces: finance, institutional systems, and raw power. Is it reasonable to expect political parties to solve our problems if political parties themselves are shaped, constrained, and targeted by the very forces producing those problems? Jefferson's ideals were not misguided. Reducing debt, preserving sovereignty, and protecting liberty were worthy aims. The failure was not moral, but practical. Jefferson offered freedom, but not a fully workable system capable of financing and defending a modern state. Under pressure, the nation reverted to central authority, a strengthened federal government with a fiscal agent that gradually influenced education, infrastructure, and energy far beyond anything Jefferson had intended. It is not that ideals are meaningless, but dreams without proper tools, systems, and structure collapse under reality. Politics has its place, but lasting solutions require more. A balance between ideological principle and practical necessity, grounded in institutions that serve people rather than power. Such institutions can only be built and sustained with rigorous transparency. Without transparency and the courage to see problems as they truly are, societies cannot equip themselves with real solutions. Truth is uncomfortable, People naturally prefer solutions that affirm their identity, their nation, their beliefs, and their sense of moral certainty. But history shows what happens when dreams ignore reality. The problems and the powers behind them appear to vanish, but cloaked in the rituals of democracy, they consolidate elsewhere, in the hands of those who understand reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. The choice then is not between parties. It is between the reassuring, comfortable lies and the contentious, uncomfortable truths. And in the end, only by confronting the latter does our future remain in our hands.